And so next we have Natalie Stewart, which hopefully you're around.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Hello.
Yep, great. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Excellent.
You are to start screen sharing, and I will introduce you. Natalie's from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and she will be talking about, what challenges do our clinicians face in paediatric blood pressure assessment? Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you for that introduction. So I'm sure everyone here can appreciate the significance of identifying and managing high blood pressure, even from childhood, because childhood hypertension can lead to serious complications if left unchecked. It therefore really follows that our clinicians should be confident in the reliability and the accuracy of the devices that we're using to measure blood pressure. However, anecdotally, we're hearing that clinicians measuring blood pressure sometimes perceive the numbers they're getting as inaccurate. Blood pressure may be remeasured until a more believable number is achieved, or it could be ignored altogether. We've also heard that this sometimes relates to kids becoming distressed during the measurement process. We wanted to investigate this further to better understand clinical practice and decision-making. Our study explores how much trust clinicians have in blood pressure devices and under what circumstances, how and when the readings are used to inform treatment, and clinicians' perceptions of how children actually tolerate having this assessment done. So for the study, we've nearly finished performing interviews online with clinicians who are actually involved in non-invasive paediatric blood pressure assessments. We've spoken with 19 doctors and nurses from the Royal Children's Hospital, both from cardiology and nephrology. So looking at the clinic outpatient setting and also in critical care in the inpatient setting. So we've used a validated qualitative framework called the Technology Acceptance Model to guide the structure of this study and ensure a bit of rigor. So this model looks at perspectives of people using a particular technology and how different factors can influence how they use it. So the interviews are semi-structured and based on this framework. And the idea is really to encourage in-depth responses from participants and to get a lot of rich data from them. And it's really a baseline study. So we're trying to identify some key themes that we can investigate on a greater level down the track. So one thing I'd like you to consider before I discuss some findings is that blood pressure assessment in children can have unique challenges to blood pressure assessment in adults. So a quote from one of my interviews, in adults, you can just say, lie still while I take your blood pressure, I'll be done in a minute. You can imagine this would be quite challenging with babies and infants. With that in mind, this next quote from my interview summarizes some of the major themes we've come across. Sometimes the children get really upset by the blood pressure machines because they inflate to a very high set level. Once they've had a few of those experiences, every time the machine comes around, they start to freak out and you get these erroneously high blood pressures. So we're talking about some kids becoming distressed by the tightness of the cuff and this distress or intolerance impacting on the output quality. This sentiment was repeated through the interviews, particularly in relation to very young children and infants in critical care, and in particular with repeated blood pressures during their stays, disturbing sleep and really upsetting the parents too. So we have unique opportunity in childhood to mitigate risk and reduce complications before they worsen or arise. These interviews are telling us that there is room for improvement in paediatric blood pressure assessment. It's probably not a completely accurate measurement, but it's the best we have. Is it time for us to challenge the standard in paediatric care? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Again, we'll wait for the questions to come through. Please send them through or raise your hands. I should be able to see it now. I guess before that comes through, I guess one of the questions again that I had that I'm again really naive in the area. The children do get stressed more easily, but is there stress response difference in the physiology that occurs within a child compared to an adult as well?
Yeah, very good question. Not something I've looked at specifically. So I've only done the interviews looking at the clinician's perspective, but it's definitely something we'd like to investigate down the track, looking at those kids in those environments and actually getting something from their physiological or psychological perspective and compare that against what the clinicians are seeing. Yeah.
Yeah. I see Rachel's asked a question. Do you have any suggestions for how to measure blood pressure better in children?
So based on what I've done so far, a few things we could implement at the moment. I think there were some ideas raised from nurses and doctors around education. So even with the automated machines inflating higher in kids, a lot of them can actually be adjusted so they don't go up as high and they're not as tight. And I don't think everyone was aware of that in the study, so that was raised a bit. So basic things like that could be implemented now. But yeah, I'm sure there's some more complicated things we could do. I think the cuff being a distressing component of the measurement, if we could do some sort of blood pressure measurement that didn't have a tight cuff, that would be great, but that might be a bit further down the track.
Yeah. And then Audrey's asked, how do you plan to move forward? I guess you kind of answered that, but if you want to elaborate on it further, how do you plan to move forward from here, as what you presented is qualitative?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously these interviews are quite broad, and we're getting these major themes, but we'd really like to condense those down into some surveys so that we can distribute them to a whole heap more clinicians in different areas, and get some more qualitative data out of this. And I guess the idea is really we're willing to identify the barriers to accurate blood pressure measurement and to like proper standardized use of the devices. And if we can work out what the challenges are, then we can improve education and implement practical changes, and we can see where the issues are so we can fix them later. Yep.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Natalie.